everybody, I'm Amber Rose, the religious hippie, and I host the podcast A Catholic's Perspective. Join me every 2 weeks as I release episodes targeted towards helping young Catholics navigate their ever-changing secular world while staying strong in their faith. Whether you are a Catholic or not, all are welcome here. So if this is something that interests you, feel free to tune in. You can find A Catholic's Perspective on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. I hope to see you there. Bye!
Hello and welcome to the Karate Priest Podcast. I'm your host, Father Daniel Duplantis. I'm a martial artist, musician, airman, and a priest of the Diocese of Houma Thibodeau. One of my other passions in life is teaching, especially teaching about the Catholic faith. Catholicism is a very deep faith. Jesus himself told Peter to put out into the deep for a catch. The most significant answers to life's most important questions often lie deep beneath the surface. Many people have questions about their faith. Through this podcast, my aim is to explore these questions and encounter incredible people along the way. Their stories show that God is constantly at work in our lives every single day, sometimes in the ordinary and sometimes in the extraordinary. Some of the topics treated in this podcast may be sensitive or controversial, but their discussion holds the key to truly living as God created us to live, which is to say that He created us to live in authentic freedom, loving Him above all else. Thank you for joining me on this journey of faith, and I hope you enjoy this podcast. Hey guys, and welcome back to the Karate Priest Podcast. I'm joined today by my producer, Todd Fischer. Todd is a regular guest who comes in, especially when as current events come up, to help commentate on some of what's happening. And so he had something that struck him recently he wanted to talk about, and that is the incorruptibility of bodies of people, specifically perhaps the saints. So Todd, welcome back to the Karate Priest.
Hi, Father Dan. Always happy to join you on the podcast.
Oh yeah, I love when you come up with these ideas of things to talk about, and it's like I wonder what Father Dan thinks about this. What does the church think about this? And so
Yeah.
and this is one that definitely maybe I take for granted as a priest because I see these cases. I hear about them, I read about them. I've yet to see one in person myself. But you're right, for someone maybe who's not familiar with the concept, incorruptibility, the fact that when some people die, their corpses do not decay at the rate that you would expect considering the conditions. So, what kind of made you want to bring this up today?
Well, certainly right now in the news for the last month is the Kansas City diocese has a nun that was exhumed to move her body to another, I think, to its final, resting site. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to take her out of her temporary grave and move her to a permanent site. So Sister Wilhelmina Lancaster, and she was buried in a wooden coffin. She wasn't embalmed. She had been buried for 4 years. And when they started to unearth her, they could see through the cracks in the wood and they saw a foot. And they had been told not, I think the people exhuming the body were told that, expect bones, that this level of decay with this type of casket, there would be no vault, that there would be bones. And there wasn't. They saw a foot. So as they opened up the coffin, they found her preserved and, like in great condition. So she's actually on display right now. And people are coming from all over the country to see this body. One of the things I found the most fascinating about it, and why I wanted to do this episode with you, was also the walls of the wooden coffin were lined with a fabric, the same fabric that her veil was made of. And the fabric that lined the coffin was decomposed. The veil on her head was not, which is also part of this incorruptibility. So I think, for me, I really enjoy hearing about sort of the X-Files parts of the Catholic Church, and so many investigations, so many things that they get into. I don't think people realize when there's a statue of Mary that's bleeding from the eyes, it's investigated. When there's Jesus in toast, it's investigated. Like there's so much stuff that's like investigated by the Catholic Church. And certainly these incorruptible corpses have been investigated by the church, and many are on display all over the world. Bodies that are hundreds of years old on display that look, seemingly like they just died. So I wanted to dig into this with you because I thought this would be an interesting topic, away from what we normally talk about. But what's your take on all this? What do you think about all this?
Well, yeah, this is something that the church sees as a sign of personal sanctity, and the idea goes to the fact that God the Father did not allow God the Son, Jesus, to experience corruption. In fact, he raised him from the dead. And so that's the primacy of the resurrection from the dead is a central belief in the Catholic faith and in the Christian faith in general. The fact that we experience a bodily resurrection. And so I think as a sign of hope for that, as a sign of the things to come, the church says that it's been shown that there are several saints that their bodies have been exhumed. And they show signs of this incorruptibility, not the fact that they don't decay at all, but certainly they don't decay at the rate at which we expect them to, especially when you mention, with the case of Sister Wilhelmina, that the fabric lining the coffin is the same kind of fabric as on her habit. That was decayed, but the fabric of her habit was not. And so, you see these kind of signs. It's like, well, wait, this isn't adding up here, and so the church looks at this, and it's not perhaps a definitive miracle for the cause of canonization for some saints. It can be considered, but oftentimes it's not the end all be all as a miracle for their canonization. And that's certainly something in this case as well with her. She died 4 years ago. You have to wait at least 5 years to begin the cause of canonization for a saint. And so it's still too early for the Vatican to even launch an investigation into this, which, and really like the kind of active part of the investigating body is the diocese itself, would be the Diocese of Kansas City, St. Joseph. And because they haven't reached that 5-year threshold yet, they're not able to do that. But this is a promising sign, and I think a lot of people will maybe look at this and say, well, this is perhaps a kind of natural mummification. And you see this, and this is, exactly how the Egyptians embalmed with, they didn't exactly have the same process we did for embalming. They didn't have the technology that we did. But certainly, putting corpses in a dry and hot place preserves them. And it's the same reason why with the Air Force, I'll bring that in for a second, we have the boneyard out in the deserts of Arizona, which is where we send our kind of mothballed airframes for preservation, because we can either take whole airframes and kind of fix them up, put them back in service, or we can mothball them for parts to put on active airframes. And so putting them in a dry and hot place preserves them. But Missouri is not the desert.
Yeah.
And so it makes you wonder, what kind of conditions, and the fact that the coffin had become unsealed because of the crack. Obviously, moisture would be allowed to get in, oxygen would be allowed to get in. And so there's a lot of signs in this case that could say that, okay, well, what other natural explanations are there for something like this happening?
I was hoping to get some experts in this episode, but we just put together this topic and I didn't have time to get anyone. We sort of have our resident geologist, Ellie Ringo, that comes on the shows, and we have some nurses and different things, because I wanted to really kind of bring up about, unembalmed bodies and the decomposition of those, and get into, what Missouri is like, and their soil and the moisture and the humidity and all of those issues. 4 years underground in a wooden coffin, there should have been far more decomposition. Even, and this is, sounds terrible to say, but even bugs, worms, nothing with her. So it just really begs the question, what kind of what is happening to preserve that body? What's protecting it? It's really, really a fascinating thing. Yeah. So
yeah, and
mind-boggling to me.
It is, and that's the whole thing, is we don't exactly understand how this happens. There's no kind of concrete answer for us, perhaps, and this is why the church does investigate these things, is it tries to provide, as far as possible, a natural explanation. And when it can't, when it's exhausted every means of scientific explanation, at some point it has to come to the conclusion that there's something supernatural going on here, not contranatural, not against nature, but something that surpasses, that is above nature. And that's why I like to keep reminding people, is that the supernatural doesn't mean that it's against nature. It simply means that it's parallel, but it's something transcendental than what we currently experience as natural on this earth.
Yeah. I think it's really fascinating about the habit not decomposing. Obviously, that's very close to her body. It's not, on the walls of the lining of the coffin. So there may be some natural explanations for that, but it would make me question whether, these items of clothing, if they're also incorruptible. I know you were a guest on the No Earthly Explanation podcast.
Oh yeah.
A couple of times, and you brought up the idea of a relic. I can't remember what we were talking about, and you kind of had the mic drop moment where you talked about whether it was a case of incorruptibility in the show. And I can't. What was it we were talking about in that?
I think maybe the Shroud of Turin or something. Or
yeah, I think maybe I think it was the Shroud of Turin or something like that, about whether it would be incorruptible, which begged the question whether items are incorruptible too. And wanted to get a recent news story. An unearthed bronze sword from more than 3,000 years ago was found. This was in a German tomb, man, a woman, and a child. And when they found the sword, this 3,000-year-old sword, it was in pristine condition, which is very rare for finding old swords. And it almost was shining. It was so well preserved. And of course, if you go out on the internet, anyone who's listening, go out and Google this and look at it and see the condition that the sword was in, because most of the time, they're rusted, they're decomposed, the handles are gone or rotted away, and this one was pristine. Bodies decomposed, sword perfect condition. And a lot of people don't realize, like, this sword existed during the Bronze Age, which was 3,300 BC to 1,200 BC. So this sword, they estimate, is a 3,000-year-old sword in great condition. Not going to say the sword is incorruptible, but could items be incorruptible? I mean, could this guy have been, Knights Templar or something? Was there some, is this sword
not Knights Templar, because the Knights Templar was certainly founded after the time of Christ, well after the time of Christ. We're talking about 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. If we're talking 3,000 years ago, that's an interesting question, because at that particular point in history, you have to remember that the resurrection of the dead had not yet happened in the person of Christ, and so that's that. And so perhaps that could be perhaps a natural scientific control to test something like that sword, and to figure out scientifically how could something be so well preserved after so long. And maybe that could give some natural explanations to why we see some of these corpses being so well preserved and incorruptible. But that's the thing too, is I think back that time, 3,000 years ago, Christ hadn't even been born, much less risen. We're talking about 1,000 years before Christ. We're talking about the time of King David.
Right. Well, here's the real issue about it, is I don't think they know they know the age of the sword. They don't know the age of the tomb. So I think that's an interesting aspect to it too, is that the people that were in it might have had a sword that was much older than them. So I think it's really a fascinating situation that they have brewing right there, trying to figure out exactly where all this came from and who these people were, because even unearthing tombs that old is incredibly rare. So they think that people in it might have been more recent and the sword be older, but this is all relatively new within the last 2 weeks, so they're still trying to figure it out. But they can identify the sword from a particular period of time, which I think is really fascinating. So it makes you wonder what that sword went through in all of that time.
It must have been extremely well constructed, and because one of my favorite shows to watch on History Channel is Forged in Fire, and you see the forging process, and you see how the slightest thing that goes wrong in the forging process can cause great imperfections in a blade, or even just not even the blade itself, but the construction of the handle and stuff, where if you use this thing in combat and use it rigorously, part of the reality of warfare was that swords break. And so it makes me wonder, maybe for this kind of sword, for it to be so old and so well preserved in its state, is perhaps maybe it wasn't even a combat sword. Perhaps it was a ceremonial sword.
Hmm.
But no matter what, for it to have been in such a great condition after so long, shows that it had to have been extremely well constructed.
Yeah, for sure. When we were researching for this episode today, I didn't realize how many incorruptible corpses were on display around the world. And as I was just browsing, like there were so many that I found pictures and explanations of who they were. I just had to quit looking after a certain amount of time. I thought, well, this is one of these issues where like this is incredibly rare. It's not. And what's really fascinating is when I started to look into other things like exhumed, like other exhumed bodies, like when they've had to, in my home area in Louisville, Kentucky area, there's a president that's buried in Cave Hill Cemetery, which was one of the presidents that they always, and I'm drawing a blank on who it was, Garfield, one of the, a president that most people don't remember, didn't do too much in office, but there's a president that's buried in Cave Hill Cemetery, and I'm drawing a blank on which one it is now. But they always speculated that maybe he had been poisoned, and they wanted to prove for history whether he had been assassinated, because there was a question of whether he was assassinated while he was in office. So they exhumed his body, which was a huge deal. So they had federal government came out, they had Secret Service agents around it, it was closed off. They brought up this president's body and they took samples of him to see, they knew that they could look at the tissue that was left with him and see if he had been poisoned. The science had caught up with that. Turned out he had not been poisoned. So they put him back in the ground and, had a big ceremony, and that was that. But they talked about how they didn't show his corpse, but they talked about how well preserved he still was after so much time. He had been embalmed though. So you do hear about exhumed bodies that look good because they were embalmed, but in most cases, it's just all decomposition. But it's incredibly rare to find, like, I can't really find cases of exhumed bodies that were old, that were not embalmed, that weren't destroyed. Like, you just don't see this in kind of the secular world happening. But there's all of these cases of incredibly religious people that have these incorruptible bodies, which is quite a coincidence, in my opinion, So, what do why? What do you think about that? Like, is this skewed one way? Are these signs we're supposed to see? Why make these bodies not
Perhaps.
decompose? For the reason to show them?
Yes, perhaps in a way, I think so, and because like I said, about the whole concept of the resurrection of the dead, is what better way for God to show people that this is something real and something concrete, than to kind of leave us reminders of that in the saints, in the people that we've determined are actually in heaven with him. And if we believe through the process of the canonization process, that we've produced miracles that show that their intercession has indeed found favor with God to effect miracles here on earth, then if they're in heaven, and heaven is outside of our concept of time, then perhaps they're already experiencing the resurrection in a way that, for those of us who exist currently in time, can't see. And so that would be, I guess, a theological explanation of it. Again, it's hard to find a natural explanation for some of this, and part of this as well too is not just like the physical condition, but think also of like the smell. That's something we haven't brought up yet. We've talked about worms and stuff, but the smell, that even with bodies who, that and I remember for a particular funeral that I did, there was concerns that they may not be able to have an open casket funeral because the funeral home was concerned about the smell. And this was for a body who was embalmed, who passed away just a few days prior. And so what happens, you'd think that in some of these cases, even if there's some decay, you think there'd be a smell. And that's not the case. In fact, what you see with a lot of these cases of incorruptibility is a lot of them have what's called the odor of sanctity, which is that not only is there's no bad smell, not only is there no smell at all, there is a smell, but that smell is something sweet.
There are I do have some data on that here, actually, that a lot of people that have been near these types of bodies have experienced smelling roses, flowers, scents like that.
Yeah.
That's what they've got, and very fascinating. Very fascinating. I want to know, I always hear, it's faith over fact. That there's not supposed to be like, if there you hear the naysayers, if there was a God, why, just can you show us some proof? Give us proof. You hear these people, give us proof. We'll believe if there's proof. But you always hear just have the faith, you don't need the facts. But we do have the cases like this. Like, so is there fact being presented? Are there signs that are being presented regularly that we should be looking for? I think you hear about, apparitions, these Mary sightings, you hear about all these things, but are they supposed to be something to encourage faith? Is it supposed to be looked at as some form of fact or proof that we need to want to believe?
Yeah, so it's certainly, the church has investigated, these instances, and that's why the church investigates it in the first place, is to exhaust, especially scientifically, but to exhaust any natural explanation for the phenomenons happening, and then to make a declaration to say, yeah, we've done all the research, we've consulted scientists, and oftentimes what happens is in some of these investigations, the church will consult non-religious scientists to get a truly I guess you could say unbiased opinion scientifically and medically on some of these instances. And then oftentimes it leads to the conversion of these non-religious scientists who become religious afterwards. But that's part of the thing is that, yes, I do think that a lot of these cases, especially the ones that the church has proven to be legitimate, is for them to serve as signs and signs of hope, signs of God's continued presence among his people, the intercession of the saints. We hear about, the Blessed Virgin Mary and her apparitions and stuff. In fact, one of the most famous incorruptible saints that we have is Saint Bernadette of Subaru, who saw Mary in the form of Our Lady of Lourdes in Lourdes, France. And so you do see these things. And now what the church teaches is that even if the church proves them to be worthy of veneration, these instances, does that mean that if you have your doubts, if you have these reservations about them, does that mean that you're a bad Christian or a bad Catholic and that you're going to hell? No, that's not what it means. The church would say that because these aren't dogmatic things, that they're not required of the Christian faithful for the sake of salvation. But they can absolutely foster devotion. That's kind of what the declaration the church does make, is if they prove them to be legitimate things, the church will say they are worthy of fostering devotion and popular piety among the Christian faithful.
You mentioned Saint Bernadette, and that's on my list here, and 18 apparitions she reported.
Right.
18. And after her death, her body remained incorruptible, and the shrine at Lourdes has become a major site for pilgrimage. So, it attracts millions of Catholics every year. And I go down the list and I look at, and almost all these people, there's pictures that they'll show. Died 1859. Body looks freshly dead. Died 1770. Body looks freshly dead. Look at his 1660. This one doesn't look that great now, but 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 you could definitely tell there's something preserving this body. I look at some of these others, 350, 1727, 1272, bodies from way back that are still on display, 1888. Pope Pius IX, 1878 on display. Pope John the 23rd died in 63 on display. Just incredible to see these bodies like this. And I'm hoping, this is real, that there isn't some other preservation tactic that's happening behind the scenes that we don't know about. But these bodies are on display in these glass caskets, or some of them look like, bamboo cages and things like that some of these bodies are in. But you can see these. You can go to these places and see these bodies and see their incorruptibility.
One of my favorite ones is and he's not a saint yet, but he's a blessed, is Blessed Carlo Acutis, who is a very young guy who died I want to say in the last 20 years, probably about 20 years ago, the early 2000s, who's known as the young saint for wearing sneakers and jeans. Very young guy, but he's famous for making a website compiling a list and information on various Eucharistic miracles that happen throughout the world. And if you look at his pictures, he looks like he could wake up at any moment, like he's just taking a nap.
Wow.
Like he is so well preserved And he died, like I said, 20 years ago. He's so well preserved that he looks like he could wake up at any moment.
Wow.
He looks like he's literally just sleeping.
I wouldn't, with Sister Wilhelmina, they're letting people touch her. Is there a reason that they're allowing people to touch her?
So that has a lot to do with the concept of relics in the Catholic Church. The concept that we use relics, which are oftentimes, and there's different classes of relics. And I guess I'll take the moment to explain these things. But relics are oftentimes either the bodies of the saints themselves or things that they used, in a sense that they kind of give us a link to their life. They give us a link to God as well, because if we believe that they're in heaven, then by holding on to, especially like parts of their bodies, which we call first class relics, it kind of gives us a connection to, again, the resurrection. And so it's oftentimes a very misunderstood thing. It's almost like a talisman, and things like that. But it's not quite, it's meant to foster devotion again. In fact, most altars in the Catholic Church, especially in churches themselves, maybe not private altars, like in the home of a priest or like in a rectory, but altars in churches, most of them traditionally have had relics in them. But they're meant to be like a link between like the saint, their life, and then the fact that if we believe that they are in heaven, then you have their physical presence in a way still there. And so with touching Saint, I'm about to call her Saint Wilhelmina, I'm thinking of Saint Philomena, and it's confusing me with Sister Wilhelmina. With Sister Wilhelmina, if people believe that she may indeed be in heaven, that she could be a saint right now, lowercase s, but could become a capital S saint, as in perhaps through the canonization process one day, then by touching her or touching objects to her body, those objects then become third class relics. So the different classes of relics are the body part of the saint. So could be their their hair, could be their bones, their skin, you name it. An actual body part is a first class relic. Something that they used, like a rosary or perhaps their clothing, would be a second class relic. And then a third class relic is pretty much any kind of religious article, object that you touch to a first class relic. It can't be a second class relic that you touch to. It has to actually be a first class relic. But like people touch holy cards or rosaries or saint medals to first class relics, and that item then becomes a third class relic. And so the third class relic is the easiest form of relic to carry among lay people, especially because they're often like a rosary or a card or something. First class relics are the actual piece of them, the saint themselves. And I actually have two. I have a first class relic of the cave of Saint Michael, which we defined as a first class relic because St. Michael doesn't have a physical body, but because we had said that he touched, the rock in this cave. So I have a relic of St. Michael's, the cave of St. Michael. And then I have a relic of St. Józef Kuntsiewicz, who is a Polish martyr. And I have his relic in what's called an antimesian, or a Greek corporal, which is a cloth that I put on my personal altar here in my room. It's actually right behind me. And it's sewn, the relic is sewn into the back of the of this cloth, so that way, because my altar doesn't have a relic stone, I could put that corporal anywhere I travel and turn any kind of normal table into a sacred space upon which to celebrate mass. It's actually a very common thing among military chaplains because it kind of makes the hood of a Humvee a more sacred place to celebrate mass. So you have that corporal that you can lay out on it, and you have something that kind of makes the space sacred for the celebration of mass if you're traveling.
I know in an early podcast episode, and maybe this wasn't even in a podcast episode, this might have just been conversational between you and I outside of podcast hours, but I thought maybe it was a Quest podcast, one of mine. We talked about proper burial for people, and what the church's stance on green funerals, cremations, organ donations, things like that. And I seem to recall you talking about bodies have to be buried intact, right? Do we talk about that?
Intact is not exactly the best word, because obviously we do allow for cremations. What the church says is that the remains have to remain together. So like if
So
you
you can't separate the ashes in a cremation. You can't put part of it over here and part of it over there. It has to be in the
exactly,
same
yeah,
place.
like scattering of ashes is frowned upon by the church.
Yeah.
Now, because that then begs the question of like with relics and stuff, taking pieces of bodies of saints,
Right.
is that a
I'm wondering
desecration?
if that's at odds with
Yeah.
the
Well,
idea that
that's the
in
thing
fact.
is they'll do these things to, I mean, like for the sake of science, just like you could take organs from from an organ donor, things like that is they do use these things. The church is not going to desecrate these items. They're going to use this to foster devotion to Christian faithful. So it's a little bit different.
With a body on display like this, that's within the rules of how someone's
Right.
buried. I mean, if you're in a glass coffin, but you're on display above ground, that still is the same as a burial. Like, how does
Yeah.
that
Yeah,
factor in? Okay.
they're buried and they're interred.
Hmm.
And that's the important thing is that you don't just have pieces of corpses laying out without being secured in some way.
Sure.
Even relics. Relics are always secured in a sense. Either in a reliquary, which reliquaries can take different shapes and forms. The little one I have from the cave of Saint Michael, it's a little rock in a small little gold vessel about this big. I say this big. Listeners can't see this. It's about, if you make a circle with your index finger and your thumb, is about the size of the little one that I have, or the one that I have in the Greek corporal is secured with a piece of cloth to the back of the big piece of cloth. So they're always secured. You never just have body parts just kind of lying around to where they can get stepped on or thrown away accidentally.
Yeah. Well, I didn't figure
There's,
it was
yeah,
that.
there's always a sense of which anything that is part of a corpse needs to be secured in a way.
Yeah.
And that's the important thing. Like that's why we don't just scatter ashes in the Catholic Church. Even cremains should be interred. But this also, to me, is in this thing too, is cremation is allowed. I would prefer not to be cremated. I can't even speak today. I would prefer not to be cremated upon my death. Because part of this too is when you see these kind of incorruptibles like this, you don't have that chance with someone who's cremated, you know. Whereas if it gives a chance to foster devotion among the Christian faithful by the fact that God can preserve the body in this visible showing of hope in the resurrection, then I think every chance should be given for that to happen.
New York has legalized green burials, but I think is the church at odds with green burials? Having a green cemetery where just bodies are put in dirt and left to decompose? That's
Uh,
not favorable, I don't think.
Probably not. I mean, I think we want to at least, mark the graves, because we always like to, especially for events like All Souls Days, to visit cemeteries, and to bless the graves, to re-bless the graves that are present. Certainly marking the graves and putting them in a more or less sacred space gives them the respect that they're due, and that way you're not just accidentally walking upon someone's grave, or or the space is desecrated. Because even for a Catholic burial, we bless the grave itself, whether it be in a mausoleum or in a crypt or in the ground. Because I've seen, in Louisiana, it's not very common, at least in South Louisiana, it's not common to have to bury people straight into the ground, even in the coffin, because of the flooding down here. We're technically below sea level. So for us, even if it's in a mausoleum or a crypt, we still bless that space. And it's supposed to be something sacred. So yeah, we would prefer that it's marked and that it is something that you can, it's clearly marked as this is a sacred space where a baptized son or daughter of God was buried, in the hope that one day they will rise forth from this place.
Well, Father Dan, I'm far older than you, so I will be dead before you, but I'll make sure that when you go, they'll have like a hologram projection of you in the Metacortex studios, as one of the original podcasts. It'll be the future. So,
A hologram projection is a little too much. I'd be fine with the fat head.
We could just put a plaque on the wall, memorial brick, and well, that's all I've got today. Thanks for talking about this. This is a great topic. It was really, really interesting. So
awesome, man. Always great to have you on here, and thanks for everything you continue to do for this podcast. So, all right, guys. With that being said, Todd Fischer can be found on Instagram, on the interwebs as Todd Fischer, TODD. It's two D's, and Fischer is FISCHER. But you can find a lot of his pages. Also, Metacortex is one of his pages. He's got several. Todd, why don't you go ahead and just name all the pages you have, because you have so many things that you do. It's so
It
hard.
would take too long. It would take so long to do it. But no, my podcast, just go check out my podcast. It's Quest with Todd. Go find that. Metacortex Publishing puts out all kinds of great podcasts, including yours, Father Dan, the religious hippie, Amber Rose, who's been on this show a million times. Whole bunch of great content, all different types of topics. Go check those out. And don't forget, Father Dan has a book. So Jesus in the Dojo is available through Metacortex Publishing as well. So go there and check that out, along with all kinds of other great content.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you, Todd. And that will conclude our time for today. We will see you all next time. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of The Karate Priest. If you enjoyed this podcast, go ahead and like The Karate Priest on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. If you're ever in South Louisiana, come visit me at the Cathedral of St. Francis de Sales in Houma. If you have any questions or comments about the show, you can also email me at thekaratepriest@gmail.com. Your questions are welcomed and may be used in future episodes. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down on you and remain with you forever. Amen.
A quest is a search for something. And every week, the Quest podcast will show you how we know what we know through interviews with people that have incredible stories of dedication and perseverance. I'm your host, Todd Fischer. Join me in this thought-provoking and inspiring podcast of discovery. Find us anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Todd Fischer and Anthony Smith and is distributed by Metacortex Publishing. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions stated in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure and visit the official website for Metacortex Publishing at metacortexpublishing.com or find us on social media for other unique content.